Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session for today at LitFestx. And a very interesting session, nevertheless, with journalist and anchor Anubha Bhonsle from CNN IBN. Anubha currently is a fellow, on pardon me if I pronounce it incorrectly. It's the Humphrey Fellowship and
Yes.
the Fulbright Humphrey Fellowship, and she is in Washington D.C. from where she's joining us for this session. Anubhav, first of all, thank you for doing this so early in the morning for you on Saturday. I'm sure as a newfound student, you must be kicking yourself for accepting this to say Saturday morning. Now again, I have to be early up, to do this session on a virtual literary festival, whatever that is.
Well, I'm caffeinated well, so I'm all set for this half an hour, 40 minutes that I'm doing this, and then I'm back to my student life.
Great, great. Um, so, Anubha, we're delighted that you've chosen to speak at LitFestx. This is, as we were discussing, the first sort of public fora where you're discussing your upcoming book, and tell us a little bit more about it. The title, as we all know, is "Mother, Where's My Country," and you are talking about Manipur and of course about Irom Sharmila as well. But you had mentioned that you've been reporting on Manipur for many years. So tell us a little bit about the background of what got you to sort of choose this subject and the backdrop for the book.
Kumar, actually, the book comes after years of sort of reportage in Manipur. And I don't think when I first sort of encountered the story, so to speak, or the landscape, this was ever the idea. I mean, I was approaching it in terms of reportage or possibly documentation or a journalistic endeavor, so to speak. So I think the first time I sort of looked at it in a little expansive way was in 2006 or so. I had encountered Manipur before that in 2004 or even before that, I mean, and those were events that sort of came and went. I mean, it was you looked at the naked protest of the Imas that they did in 2004. You looked at the Prime Minister's visit. But I think I was looking at it very event-based. In 2006, and since then, I have returned every year to Manipur and either gone there just for reporting of an incident, but I've almost always stayed there for long periods of time and tried to sort of unlayer this landscape. Sharmila was obviously one of the first attractions, and I think like many others, just how the fast was and this nasal tube runs down her nose and her odd method of fasting and how the state keeps her alive through force feeding. I mean, I think I encountered those questions like anyone else would encounter them if you were to meet someone like this. But I have to say, and I sort of have to underline and emphasize that the book goes far beyond Sharmila. I mean, Sharmila is a thread that runs through the book. The book actually arcs the life of this state in Manipur, and I think Manipur is a very difficult state and a very complex state to tackle. And I've had many editors and I've had many journalists who often talk about the apathy of distance, and it's always strange to me as to why there should be an apathy of distance in this day and time. I mean, this is a landscape where army men will walk on the streets of Manipur. This is a landscape where there are peaceful protests. This is a landscape where you don't even know what insurgent groups stand for. This is a landscape where you hear phrases like recycled militants. This is a landscape where the state pumps in, I mean, crores and crores and crores of money every year. This is a landscape which is almost like a sponge. It takes it all in and there's almost nothing to show for. but it's also a landscape which has really been hurt over the years. I mean, there's a historical story to it. There is a people story to it. There are voices to it. So over the years, I've sort of realized that there were many stories to tell, and they did tie into each other. And I think it's a couple of years ago that I decided that I wanted to put a framework to it. Of course, the book looks very different now from when it actually began.
So, at the core, would you say that you've actually tried to uncover in many ways the many layers, the many issues surrounding Manipur and its people, or have you really taken, one sort of core narrative, right through?
Um, Kumar, I think it's not the latter; it's the former. You will find this book as an amalgamation of the many voices that exist in Manipur. So you will find voices from an insurgent camp in Manipur. You will find voices of the Naga insurgency. You'll find voices of people in the Naga inhabited areas. At the same time, you'll find voices like Sharmila's. You'll find voices of this strange contrast that she's going through. I mean, she's in a relationship which is not acceptable after all these years of sort of making her an icon. People aren't willing to accept what is a personal decision. You'll find voices of many people who've been victims of human rights violations. And I think I just want to say a very important thing here, that often at the time that people are overwhelmed by the violence that's been caused to them, they're not in a position to talk about it. I mean, and that is not the best time to talk about many of these things. So I think in these years, I've just waited really long. I have waited for people to tell their stories of how they want it to be told. Um, and I think in this book, you'll possibly, and I'm hoping when people read it, they'll see that level of patience that is there. I mean, people have been allowed to tell their stories, and yet at the same time, it's not a book that only talks about on this side of the gun. It's also a book that talks about the other side of the gun.
And so you have also then spoken about a lot of the insurgent camps uh, which were there that time during your reporting of Manipur. Tell us a little bit about how that has come into play.
There are a lot of narratives that are that are centered and that actually play out from the life of an insurgent camp and how it is. Most people who are in Manipur and cover Manipur or cover the areas that we label the Northeast will actually not blink an eye about this. But I think sort of the rest of the country needs to look at the fact that this is a landscape where large tracts of land are not owned by the government, where the writ of the government is sort of this large gray area, and these are these insurgent camps. Now, it's also a landscape where the government is almost giving a stipend of sorts to militants who have given up their guns. It's a landscape where whether those guns are recycled or those militants come back into circulation, there aren't tangible, real methods of finding that. The book has narratives about at least 2 to 3 insurgent camps where I've spent days, and it's sort of there are people who've been who I've spoken to in great detail, and these are men who are let's say MSc, or they're well-educated men. They've thought about why they have picked up the gun. Other members of their family have not picked up the gun. They've talked about all of that. They've talked about their life. They've talked about what they've gone through. So there is enough narrative to indicate as to why the insurgency began, where it is at this particular moment in time when, let's say the government of the day has signed what is a broad framework of agreement with the biggest Naga group, the NSC and IM. Yet for all practical purposes, this particular group has camps within the state. I just want to underline, and perhaps maybe when people do read the book, they would understand. political narrative, as far as Manipur is concerned, is one that hides behind curtains. There is never a great clarity in which any of the political narrative comes out. For in a sense, if you were to ask the chief minister of the state, does the NSC and IM have any camps in Manipur? He would say no. No, they don't. Because the NSC and IM till some time ago was in a ceasefire that operated only in Nagaland. But there are camps in Manipur. They do exist. Um, so you've got to sort of break the untruth first and sort of
Right.
tackle this insurgency first on. And I think the narratives will hopefully unlayer some of that.
Speaking of the agreement and the sort of hidden, if you will, insurgent camps, um, where do you see the whole interplay of the AFSPA in Manipur with respect to the current agreement that's been signed? The fact that there are insurgent camps still around, and the phrase you mentioned, what was that, recycled militants. So how do you see all of this coming together? I think the number of factors or levers are clearly just increasing. And how do you see the interplay between all of this?
Uh, Kumar, I mean, there are various facets to it. The fact is that the broad agreement that's been signed by the government and the NSC and IM is an agreement of which no details are out. If it's an agreement that goes back to the, if it talks about sovereignty, or if it talks about the fact that the IM has given away its demand of Greater Nagalim, those things need to be said. I don't think either sides will be in a position to say it out clearly. So I think it's too early for anyone to actually say what the broad framework is, because absolutely no details of that broad framework are available. There are aspects to it which point us to what perhaps the NSC and I would have agreed to. The fact that you had one of the leaders who was in a hospital and actually signed the accord from a hospital bed is an indication that the Naga insurgency is getting old. Its leaders are getting old, and they do want to possibly come to some kind of an agreement. That's something that points to the decision. Can the AFSPA be repealed because the government has so-called signed this framework? I think it's too early to say that. We also must remember that even after the framework has been signed, nothing really has changed on the ground. In fact, the day the framework was signed, I happened to speak to a couple of leaders and make some phone calls in the camps to try and find out whether they were taken in by surprise, how they understood it. Well, there was a complete blackout of any information that came to them. I mean, people who lead some of these groups, lead some of these revolutions, know how narratives have to be played. So currently nothing has changed. The camps still continue to exist. The guns still continue to be there. The army still continues to keep an eye on those camps. So, repealing AFSPA, or whether AFSPA goes out of Manipur, is a completely sort of different story that needs to be tackled differently. Currently, just from the perspective of the framework, I don't believe too much has changed on the ground.
So, just shifting gears a little to the title of our session today, denial of memory, denial of justice. Tell us a little bit more about these words.
One of the reasons I sort of engaged with your group and looked at this, because I think Manipur is a place where people believe that their stories haven't been told, where their memory, in a sense, has been denied to them. It is a state which believes its accession to the Indian state has been a problematic one. They believe they've been slighted. They believe that their sense of identity has never been recognized. Their language was never recognized. Their culture and the very rich cultural heritage has never been recognized. It is also a unique state currently, and I saw this very closely, where there is sort of competitive victimization, if I can frame it that way, where many of the Naga people that I spoke to seem to suggest that, we were the original victims of AFSPA. AFSPA brutalized us first. But they do believe that the narrative now, let's say since 2000 onwards, has actually changed to speak only about the other victims of AFSPA. And primarily, I think that's a hint towards Sharmila, that you're only speaking about the other side, or the other community that has been victimized, the Maitais, or you're speaking of that. So, in a sense, I think it speaks of the psyche of this state, that that sees marks of impunity at such close quarters. Uh, so I'm a, which is the reason I spoke about denial of memory, because they also often indicate that you first got to accept the fact that violations did take place. You first have to accept the fact that Manorma was brutalized. She could have been a cadre of an insurgent outfit, but there was simply no way that anyone could accept the kind of brutalization. And similarly, there are many stories where they believe that some of these truths have never come out. I mean, the Justice Hegde Commission ruled that out of the 7 random cases he picked out from a list of, I think, 1,900, the 7 were fake encounters. They were fake encounters. You've got to accept it. You have to accept it. Once the acceptance happens, perhaps we can move forward.
You mentioned a very important thing in terms of acceptance of some of these issues, and the fact that people felt that there was probably too much of importance or too much of coverage given to one person, which is Iram Sharmila, and she clearly has been the focal point of a lot of these discussions, and in many ways manifests the media's positioning of issues in Manipur, right? And there's no other name in popular sort of conversation besides Iram Sharmila. So tell us a little bit more about your interaction with her and your sort of findings.
I first met her, Kumar, in 2006 when she had brought her protest to Delhi, and she had been arrested a couple of days after she brought the protest to Jantar Mantar, and she was lodged in the Ram Manohar Lohia hospital. Access to her was extremely limited, and I had managed to gain access to her pretending as a friend and a human rights activist, and um, I mean that was my first interaction. There was sort of no chemistry, so to speak. There was nothing. I was a stranger to her, and possibly quite like anyone else who was coming. And I think I went into that story a little naive, because obviously, like many others, it was this sort of unique feeling from protest. Why are you doing it? And how have you managed? And remember, the fast was already on for 6 years in 2006. I mean, I encountered it pretty much like that. And I remember there were conversations that she felt a little better, because in the earlier days she was in a really bad shape. I have seen her in extreme anger, in extreme pain, in extreme states of emotion. But in Delhi itself, as she got better, we did manage to break the ice a little bit and speak about the fact. And she sort of said that, I know you're never going to come there. You're going to be here, and which is the reason I had to bring my fast here, because apparently no one cares about that state. So the book, in many ways, has considerable contribution from her. Her thoughts, her jokes, her memories, her second thoughts, etc., are all part of the book. In the initial years, access to her was completely out of the question in Manipur. It was just a long, painful, arduous task, which meant that you approached the court first, and then you took the letter to the government of the day, and the government of the day had to sign, and then you got the jailer, and the jailer let you into the hospital, and all conversations were in the presence of the authorities. Sharmila herself, at that point in time, wasn't someone who was who could speak coherently what her thoughts were, or even if she did. And of course, language was a big barrier at that point in time. I mean, we spoke in English, but at that point in time, she was still struggling with how to best articulate her thoughts. Um, I think over the years, I have gone every year when she's released, because this particular charge, that is the attempt to suicide charge, has a maximum sentence of 1 year. So after that, she is released for about a day or two, and during that time, Sharmila removes the tube from her nose and walks out of the hospital, and stays in this small shack-like area. And I think she's barely allowed to stay there for about a day or two more, because she refuses to take any force feeding, and her condition deteriorates, and she goes back to the hospital, and the charge sort of repeats itself. So it's going to be 15 years and it repeats itself. But many of these years, since 2006 to this year, uh, yes, this year is as well, I have tried and made sure that I am in Manipur in the period that she is released, because that's the time we get to sort of talk about things. I mean, I think she has spoken to me about many parts of this entire struggle, about her own life, and I think I've spoken to her at different points in time, in sickness, in health, in highs and lows. Um, I have seen her change some of her thoughts or articulate them much better. So the book has a lot of that. The book has allowed her to change her opinion. Um, uh, and in today's time, to just sort of briefly answer your question, yes, she does sort of occupy this space, but I think she occupies this space primarily because of this iconic nature of her fast. And I still do believe that it is the manifestation of her fast, this unique feeding form and all of that, that sort of attracts people. I think her cause still is a cause that hasn't captured the imagination. Um, I think there's a reluctance even in Manipur, to some extent. I mean, forget about the rest of the country.
So you hit on something very interesting, that people know of her fast, but there is very limited knowledge of the reasons for why she's doing this. And do you find that something which is common across the country, or is it you know uh, is it something which you dug in because of your reportage?
I think, Kumar, it sort of unraveled itself, because, I mean, here was a fast that was going on for 15 years. Here was a woman who had sort of given up all pleasures of what normal, ordinary life can be. Here is a woman who has understood what the nature of this fast is. So she makes a very clear distinction between the fact that this fast is a protest, and this protest needs to be carried to its logical conclusion. It needs elements of what any protest across the world needs. It needs a coming together of people. It needs organization skills. It needs to be talked about. But yet, Manipur, in some ways, has not managed to take that particular protest outside the realm of this one individual. I mean, she's sort of become an icon, and the Manipuri society at large believes icons cannot do this and icons cannot do that. There has been so much talk about who she wants to live with, and who she's in a relationship with, and who's the man who's sort of come close to her. And I don't think as much was ever spoken about her fast and what she stood for. I think
Right.
for the country outside, the protest is seen only from the realm of AFSPA. And yes, it is a protest against AFSPA, but I think it's sort of you know people outside Manipur have not realized what life is in Manipur, what people of Manipur actually live with, what they've almost got habituated to it. Imagine 100 days when petrol is rationed. Imagine 12-kilometer line of bikes parked to get 5 liters of petrol. Imagine the fact that you always have to wear an identity card outside. Imagine the fact that if a blockade comes, you just sort of put your eyes down and hope that the guy doesn't stop you. Imagine, and I mean, much of these are real life instances that I have seen myself, or people who've traveled with me have had to face. I mean, remember one instance when we traveled and our car was stopped and I was untouched. But the so-called Manipuri locals who were traveling with me had a complete body search. Their faces were dug to the road. Much of this has happened. And yes, we can get into the narrative of who calls for the AFSPA and how do we live with a situation where there are insurgent camps and how can the army be operating in a state without AFSPA. Those are larger questions, but those questions at least need to be asked, debated. And I think the tragedy is that after 15 years of Sharmila's fast, even that conversation is not happening.
True, true, very true. We've been getting some questions from our online audience. Quite a few of them, I think you've just been answering, but I'm going to take maybe just one or two of them. You know, uh, so one, of course, an obvious one is that people are excited to know, what was the experience when you actually started to write this book, given also that this is your first book. So, like you mentioned earlier in the conversation, that because of your reportage of Manipur for almost 9 or 10 years, or even earlier, you obviously had a lot of viewpoints and a lot of content to dig into. But when you started writing the book, what was that experience like? And considering that you had to look at material for probably over a decade.
You're right. I mean, but this is a book. This is a contemporary book. It's a book that has to tackle the history of Manipur and how it acceded to the Indian state and how it felt and sort of the growth of the insurgency, whether it's the Naga insurgency or the Meitei insurgency. It does tackle all of that. I think when I first sat down to write the book, Sharmila was overwhelming in my head. Um, she was the story I thought that I wanted to tell, and I wanted to unlayer, uncover. I wanted to dig deeper into who she was, how she was as a child, etc. I think as the years progressed, I realized that Sharmila's story cannot be told without telling the story of Manipur. And I think at that point in time, I changed sort of the axis of the book. The axis of the book is the many stories of Manipur and how they've never been told. We've encountered, I mean, the fact is that I sometimes wonder why they're not told, because there are stories that sort of touch on every human emotion, so to speak. So if you have a encounter that leads to the death of a National Child Bravery Award winner, why should that not be? I mean, why? How can that story not be told? If you have a story of where a young girl who's a Geeta Chopra awardee winner, 6 years old, dies of a bullet, why is that story not told? How can that story not be told? If you have a story where 12 mothers have, in a conservative society like that, disrobed themselves and stood stark naked in front of a Kangla fort to protest a human right violation, how can that story not be told? Um, how can one not try to dig deeper and understand as to how the army actually operates in this land where they sometimes don't understand. In the initial years, the people that they were trying to protect were alien to them. They didn't understand the language. Um, it's interesting for any reporter, for anyone who's interested in documenting or this kind of a reportage, to try and understand why is it that these people are staying, in these insurgent camps. What happens in an insurgent camp if you have a ceasefire of 12 years, 12, 13 years? I mean, how much of you do get rusted? I mean, are we really believing that the NSA and IM is actually going to engage and sort of step up this conflict in some ways? So, those are questions that were staring at me even as I was trying to tell this one story of Sharmila. And I think I feel much more confident about this changed axis of trying to sort of tell the story of Manipur and Sharmila being the thread in that story of Manipur. So, I mean, it's been a process of sort of trying to find what my voice was.
But it sounds like a very, very exciting piece of work, Anubha. and certainly one which you are clearly very very passionate about. I guess having been there several times and really been in the thick of action, whether it is going to insurgent camps or whether it is meeting Irom Sharmila or the average person in Manipur and seeing firsthand the atrocities and the issues that they face. um, Clearly, I think this book will be a very poignant account of the state of Manipur. Not just as a state, but really the state in which they are. And we wish you all the best, and I hope that this book will be a bestseller. And we look forward to interacting with you in December when the book is out, and we look forward to another conversation about it.
Thanks so much, Kumar. I often have learned to say that first-time authors cannot be choosers. So thank you very much for trying, to sort of unlayer what I've done. And as I said, this is the first time I've sort of spoken about the book, and I think it's been a good process for me as well.
Thank you so much, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks, Kumar.